Ha, it's finally over. A grouchy feeling settled over Clara as she departed for Lygia's central keep. It wasn't over the fact that she had been forced to sit outside the Great Hall for 8 hours just in case Queen Auricula's court required her, nor was it because Leanne and Florine got to roam around the city doing all sorts of interesting things while she did so. No, it was because Ludmilla had appeared for all of 38 minutes and 22 seconds to see the Queen, and then left immediately afterwards. Her lips stuck out in a pout as she made her way along the covered walkways of the city's long-neglected central gardens. It was a suspiciously familiar scenario. Legends and fancifully spun tales alike often spoke of great generals and captains who spent more time on the battlefield than anywhere else. Sometimes, those stories never once mentioned them returning home to spend time with their loved ones. In fact, whoever recorded and rendered the things often took the time to tell of spouses and lovers waiting in their cold and lonely beds for attention that would never come their way. She understood that war stories tended to cater to a certain type and often lacked in their romantic aspects for that reason, but she couldn't help but draw comparisons between the protagonists in those stories and Ludmilla. Ludwig needs to spend more time with Clarence. Whenever Florine next asked for feedback on her writing, she would definitely slip that in. Clara made her way to the edge of the garden and stared at the boulevard leading out into the city. Like every other urban center in the Draconic Kingdom, Felicia had no draft animals to spare. Never mind draft animals, all of the province's livestock was long eaten by the Beastman invaders. The few dozen animals delivered by Ruin's Wake were immediately whisked off to wherever they were needed, and thus no carriages were available for hire. Still, it wasn't as if she was a cripple. If there were no carriages, she could simply walk like everyone else. Maybe she could catch up with Leanne and Florine. "If you take a single step out into that rain, my lady," Tyre said from behind her, "your dress will instantly soak through and your hair will turn into a rug." "It wouldn't turn into a rug," Clara frowned. She reached into her infinite haversack and produced a wide umbrella. Tyre sighed and she reached out to take it from her. "Where will we be going, my lady?" she asked. "Do we need to be going anywhere in particular?" Clara answered, "Not every journey requires a destination." Tyre opened the umbrella and held it up between them as they walked out into the rain. Though even the city's main boulevards were mostly empty and the shops sparsely stocked, Clara still thought the surroundings filled with things of note. Foremost was Felicia's infrastructure. What she saw applied to the entirety of the country. Torrential rains that would have overwhelmed any drainage system in Riestais or the Empire with laughable ease were smoothly accommodated in every town and city in the Draconic Kingdom. The highways and rural roads never showed any sign of falling apart from the extreme conditions. Every street was well lit, and it wasn't just in the cities. Even the villages had magical lighting for their humble squares. Every town had proper stone walls and a magical water source. Their port infrastructure was far in advance of anything she had seen short of the Sorceress Kingdom's new facilities. As most of what she and her staff have come up with imitated or improved on what could be found in the north, the Draconic Kingdom displayed a wealth of innovations and design principles that Corlin Harbor could benefit from. Beyond its infrastructure, everything about the Draconic Kingdom told the remarkable tale of a country that simply wouldn't give up. Every time they were knocked down, they got back up and became better. As it was often said, need drove innovation, and struggle built character. Culturally and economically, at least. There was one major issue with the Beastman incursions that she knew could not be rectified by indomitable will. With that thought in mind, she made her way over to the local Temple of the Six. While it wasn't the largest temple in the city, she was surprised to find it empty. Perhaps that shouldn't be a surprise, considering the circumstances. She waited while Tyre found a place to dry their umbrella. They slowly walked up the aisle together, looking up at the icons and tapestries lining the walls. It was much like the Erantal Cathedral before the advent of the Sorceress Kingdom. Each of the six had equal representation, and there were a few old relics likely gifted by the theocracy when the temple was founded. Overall, there was a simple humility to everything, which only lent to its sense of sanctity. "Oh, They turned to find a young woman with dusky skin and dark hair approaching them from the temple's inner cloister, adorned in the robes of a junior priestess. The blue trim of her outfit marked her as an adherent of the water god. Clara and Tyre lowered their heads in a curtsy as she rushed up to greet them. "I hope the evening finds you well, priestess," Clara said. "Blessings of the Six be upon you." The priestess went down in a heap in front of them. Clara's lip twitched. A priestess of the water god slipped in a puddle. I like that blue garter, though. Are you all right? Clara asked. I'm all right. The priestess sat up and pulled down the skirts of her robe. How may our temple serve you? We just came to perform our devotions, Clara replied. I also had a few questions for you, if you don't mind. I would be glad to answer if I can, the priestess said, then sighed. It isn't as if I have anything else to do. Clara held out a hand toward the priestess. Please don't let the current situation weigh too heavily on your spirit, she said. I believe you've gotten past the darkest of recent times. I guess. The priestess reached out to take her hand. Oh, you're strong. And your eyes? She's sharp. I hope that means she has the answers I'm looking for. Countess Clara Odelia Dale Corlin, she introduced herself. From the Sorceress Kingdom. This is my lady's maid, Tyre. CCC Countess? The priestess' eyes threatened to fall out of their sockets. And the Sorceress Kingdom, isn't where all those undead that swarmed the countryside came from? Not precisely, Clara said, but close enough. Also, we're in the temple, I should be the one deferring to you. The priestess blinked several times before nodding slowly. Right. Sorry. I mean, thanks? No, anyway, I'm Sidin, a junior priestess. The most senior junior priestess, and since none of the senior staff are left, sorry about this, the bishop was always the one who dealt with the important people. I understand, Clara said. If you don't mind my asking, how many of the temple staff remain? Just 3 of us. The 2 others are on the morning and afternoon shifts. Just 3 of you, Clara frowned, yet you don't have much to do? Yep, Priestess Sidin replied. Back during the occupation, we were always out of mana summoning food and sundries, tending to the sick and wounded, and generally trying to keep the city going. Now that everything's over and supplies are arriving in the city, all we receive is resentment. It's funny, we always saw a surge in popularity whenever the theocracy came around to drive the beastmen back. It's someone else this time and suddenly it's like all those generations of past assistants ever mattered. That's hardly fair. I know, right? Also, the theocracy may be the seat of the faith, but isn't the faith itself. All of the temples here have served the people through thick and thin. Clara walked over to an offering plate near the head of the nave. She placed 60 platinum trade coins upon it. The priestess stared. I'm afraid I can only assist with your mundane needs, Clara told her. If the temples in the Sorceress Kingdom weren't so short-staffed, I would recommend that they send people here to help. To be honest, Priestess Sidin said, I thought the whole north was lost to the heresy. Not entirely, Clara smirked. My territories are on or close to the theocracy border, so the faith has always been strong there. I see, but you said you're short-staffed? Does that have anything to do with the undead thing? The Sorcerer King's undead servitors bring no harm to law-abiding individuals in the Sorceress Kingdom, Clara told her. Even lawbreakers are simply arrested and subjected to proper judicial processes. The fears that many people harbor are far from the truth. Since the advent of the Sorceress Kingdom, both the citizens and the faith of the Six are flourishing in the Duchy of Eranthal. Really? Really? As much as she would have liked to, Clara couldn't go around telling everyone that Sursana had returned. It was something one had to see to believe. And in the Draconic Kingdom, maybe not even then. Her eyes went to the walls and ceiling. Unlike in the theocracy, there appeared to be no images of Sursana in the Draconic Kingdom's temples, only the icons and symbols associated with him. Personally, it didn't sit well with her. They were watering down an aspect of the faith that they deemed unsavory just to appeal to the locals. Since you mentioned it, Clara said, I'm curious what your stance is on the undead. Priestess Sidin glanced cautiously at their surroundings. I'm not going to get in trouble for saying anything bad, am I? In my time here, I don't think I've heard anything worse than the common perceptions surrounding the undead. Oh. Well, I'm somewhere around there, I think. The undead are the enemies of all life and should be treated as such. Are you referring to undead beings that manifest in negative energy zones, or all undead? Not many point out that distinction, even amongst our faithful. Undead that spawn in negative energy zones are essentially atrocities made manifest, so they're a resounding nope. When it comes to tier magic, Necromancy's just a school of magic like any other. The gods know I'd zapped dozens of those stinky beastmen with inflict wounds spells. When it comes to animating the dead, however, Sir Sana is the god of death. If you're doing it without his permission, then you get a mace in the face. Not you, specifically. Clara pondered the young priestess' response. Was it something that the temples of the Six in the Sorceress Kingdom could use in their future efforts? Spreading the good news of Sir Sana's return was a strangely touchy venture. Broadly speaking, anyone who made that claim outside of the Sorceress Kingdom would be considered mentally deranged. In that case, what do you think about angels? Angels are instruments of the god's will, Priestess Sidon replied matter-of-factly. Divine messengers. Even if they're summoned? They wouldn't answer the summon if it was against the god's will. What if a cleric of the Four came and summoned one to attack you? They're heretics for a reason. Clara kept a straight face throughout the line of questioning. Though they were all of the same faith, the drift that had occurred between different places was both a curious and worrisome thing. According to Captain Cavallaro, witnessing the faith of the Six in Erantle felt like he had stepped into the past. It had the old, evangelistic flavor reminiscent of the time of the Great Seeding. In combination with the fact that Riestais was a secular state, it meant that the faith of the Six in Erantle was close to its form from before the demon gods. In a word, they could be considered the faith's most orthodox denomination in the region. The faith of the Six in the slain theocracy showed clear, at least to her, signs of its practice by a nation considered the preeminent human power. They were the leader of humanity's hegemony in the region, plus they had assumed the role of its defender to maintain that hegemony. Thus, the tenets of the faith were interpreted and employed in ways that supported that position. The faith of the Six in the theocracy was several orders of magnitude more aggressive than anywhere else. In the Draconic Kingdom, the faith of the Six bore many similarities to the faith in Erantle. Its faithful were only a fraction of the total population and it didn't involve itself in politics. Instead, it was focused on serving humanity. Additionally, the Draconic Kingdom was a country ruled by what was technically an enemy of humanity, a dragon lord. At first, Clara couldn't figure out why the queen was treated that way. As time passed, however, it was clear that Draudel Auriculus did not perceive the world as a human did, nor did she enact her will upon her domain as a human sovereign would. In the end, Clara decided that trying to nudge things along on her own would be far too reckless. As with many things, time was required to enact proper change. His Majesty always provides us with the best examples. We would all do well to follow his lead. Her mind settled on the matter, she moved on to her second topic. With things as they are in the Draconic Kingdom, Clara said, do you have much trouble maintaining the lists? The lists? Priestess Sidon frowned in thought, as in the local genealogies? That's right. The only time we usually have problems is when a province is wiped out, but I guess that's not a problem for bookkeeping. After events like that, it's just a matter of tracking migration. We've always worked together with the government for that, Gem. That might be difficult this time around. Was there a specific line you were looking for? No, it was more a general question. After we arrived in your country, I couldn't help but notice the beastmen's patterns of behavior. It begs an investigation of how the potential of humanity has been affected. Beastman customs were the expression of a sort of natural practicality. One that was shared with farmers when it came to crops and livestock. Just as a farmer selectively encouraged desirable traits and discouraged undesirable ones in the plants and animals that they cultivated and raised, the beastmen did the same with their prey in the Draconic Kingdom. The strong were targeted first. The most aggressive and defiant individuals died with them. Lords were seen as prime quarry. According to Ludmilla, it was similar to how wild predators weeded out the old and the sick, which resulted in a healthier population of prey animals. With the beastmen, however, intelligence developed that natural behavior into something far more complex. Their cultural practices served to enforce a state of weakness onto prey populations, making it progressively easier to manage them with every passing generation. This, in turn, facilitated the success of future generations of beastmen. Of course, as they were also intelligent beings, humans would still try to figure out how to keep fighting. Unfortunately, the removal of the traits that the beastmen considered undesirable in their prey was not something one could fix through sheer grit. If taken to an extreme, that grit wouldn't even exist anymore in the population. As a martial noble, Ludmilla was always perceived as both a reassuring and dangerous presence by her civilian peers. Even as someone who had known the martial noble since childhood, Clara also couldn't help but feel that way about her. While it caused all sorts of amusing situations for her in civilian settings, Ludmilla never believed that there was anything wrong with the way that she was. If anything, she was proud of being a dangerous person. Everything that contributed to that sense of danger, her aggression, fighting instincts, intuition as a war leader, willingness to take life and a multitude of other traits, was essential for the martial elite in a world where the weak were offered no quarter. She was born and bred to fight, kill, conquer and die for her people, and she stood unwavering in her station. The priestess' cheerful expression faded, replaced by one of resignation. "So you noticed. As expected of a noble of our faith. How bad is it?" Clara asked. "We're starting from scratch, basically," the priestess sighed. "No, our current popularity has us suffering a setback before we've even gotten started. The Temple of Bounty always marries people left and right after something like this, too." "I was wondering about that. By all reports, they're a minor faith, but by all appearances, they're absurdly popular." "They're a minor faith?" Priestess Sidon tilted her head curiously. "They're not?" "Not at all." "Oh, I guess you're going by official statistics." "What else would one refer to?" "A shift in perspective is necessary," the young priestess told her. "Things get muddled because we have some well-defined polytheistic religions in the mix. The faith of the six, the four, the path of enlightenment isn't even a religion, but it gets lumped in with us anyway. The others are counted as their own religions because they have their own respective temples, doctrines and administrations. Since the government defines religious organizations along those lines, the statistics end up looking like what you probably saw." "But, in reality, they're not independent temples?" "No, they are. The thing is that all those deities are part of the same pantheon. At least something close to a pantheon. A fisherman's wife goes to the Temple of Storms to pray for favorable weather while her husband is out at sea. But she doesn't go to the Temple of Storms to pray for the healthy delivery of their child, she goes to the Temple of Bounty." Clara wrapped her arms around her waist as she recalled the demographics of the Draconic Kingdom. "But that means over 70% of the Draconic Kingdom worships the Mistress of Bounty. And the rest of that whole pantheon. It's much like the sects in our faith. I'm an adherent of the water god, while you're an adherent of, Sursana," Clara filled in for her. "Right. Wait, Sursana? Is there something wrong with that?" "No, not at all. It's just extraordinarily rare in the Draconic Kingdom. I've never met one before. Most of our faithful are adherents of water, life, and earth. In that order." "That makes sense," Clara said, "considering what the Draconic Kingdom is like. As for myself, the god of death, judgment, and justice is a suitable choice for a noble, is he not?" "I can see that," the priestess nodded, "but our nobles usually don't become adherents of Sursana. Anyway, now you know. About the Mistress of Bounty thing. Still, it's not all doom and gloom for us. The way they do things in the Draconic Kingdom is pretty interesting as a strategy to preserve desirable bloodlines." "Oh?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "The folks from the theocracy tend to interpret our tenets in a certain way." Priestess Sidon leaned against a pew with one hand while gesturing in the air with the other. "They're all isolate, refine, cultivate, repeat." Clara nodded. It was the prevalent approach to cultivating strong lineages. In fact, she knew of no other when it came to the particular tenets the priestess was referring to. "But that's a strategy for when a population has secured a strong and stable position," the priestess told her. "For a country that's gotten their feet under them, one that has built themselves up, needs to protect what they've built up, and hopefully expand at some point." As she continued to speak, the priestess' voice grew more confident and authoritative. "A country like the Draconic Kingdom isn't in that position," she said. "If anything, it's the opposite here. In terms of the average person, the strong do not flourish, they get picked off first. Any effort at cultivating strength tends to be futile. So, instead, the people here work to preserve what they can. More to the point, whenever the Draconic Kingdom suffered a beastman incursion, everything aside from its people was left in one piece. The beastmen only cared about food and prestige. And the Draconic Kingdom consciously does this. They don't consider things in those terms," the priestess replied. but that's effectively what's going on. Except with the nobles, they've always been about the blue blood thing and they preemptively scatter their signs across the country so there's always someone around to inherit. With the rest, depleted populations are restocked with young migrants from everywhere, turning every province into a reservoir for all of the country's bloodlines. So when the opportunity presents itself, the temples of the Six will encourage a switch to the cultivation strategy and work to refine those bloodlines again. Precisely, the priestess smiled. The activities of the country and the other faiths in this respect are not at odds with our tenets, and our long-term goals accommodate the circumstances of the Draconic Kingdom. Except if the country is overrun entirely. Priestess Sidon grimaced. She twisted a long lock of dark hair around her finger. Well, that came as a complete surprise, she said. The Draconic Kingdoms had a long-standing arrangement with the theocracy and I cannot for the life of me think of why the theocracy wouldn't honor it this time around after doing so reliably for generations. Also, the way the beastmen came this time was unprecedented. We may as well have been facing a natural disaster. Going by Ludmilla's assessment, the priestess wasn't too far off with her analogy. The sheer inertia behind the beastman migration was akin to a nationwide avalanche. They were far from regular circumstances, and there was nothing the Draconic Kingdom could have done to stop it with their available resources. So do the other temples of the Six in the Draconic Kingdom follow the same reasoning? As far as I know, yes. We'll still have to hold a council meeting after the dust has settled. To be certain, the temples of the Six will be facing an uphill battle with all that's happened, but we will not waver in our service to humanity. We still have our supporters in the royal court as well, so it shouldn't be all that bad. It's just a rough patch for the short term. I'm glad to hear it, Clara smiled. I'll be sure to check in on how you're doing in the future. Thank you for coming to see us, Countess Corlin. The priestess returned her smile with one of her own. For your charity, as well. It's so heartening to know that we have brothers and sisters abroad looking out for us. Priestess Sidon accompanied them back down the nave of the temple. At the same time, two silhouettes appeared out of the rain, resolving into a pair of familiar figures. Ah! Minister Sorul. Clara lowered her head in a curtsy. Marshal Zalu. I hope the evening finds you well. Minister? Marshal? All at once, Priestess Sidon's hard-earned composure collapsed. Good priestess, I hope the evening finds you well. The minister and marshal paid their respects to the thoroughly flustered Priestess Sidon before they turned their attention to Clara. Countess Corlin, Salacia Sorrel said with a smile, if you would be so kind as to pardon my boldness, I am most curious to know what you are doing here. Why, performing my devotions, Your Excellency, Clara smiled back. I was also gifted with the opportunity to have the most enlightening conversation with Priestess Sidon here. What a coincidence, the minister undid her rain-slicked mantle. We have come to do just the same. Why would it be a coincidence? What else would nobles do at a temple? The symbol of Allah Alaf nestled in Salacia's cleavage glittered in the temple's soft lighting. The woman wasn't as big as Florine, but, unlike Florine, she had no qualms about flaunting what she had. If she were a follower of the Four, whose religion was strangely obsessed with sexual purity, Clara might have pointed out that Salacia was doing something sacrilegious with a holy symbol. As a follower of the Six, however, she would probably just say it was a pious expression of fertility, nourishment, or some other thing associated with the god of life. She wouldn't be lying, either. The difficulties she presented aside, Clara had no doubt Salacia Sorul was a devout member of their faith and everything that she did as a courtier was in service to her queen and her country. As such, Clara couldn't bring herself to hate her, but the woman was certainly annoying for the time being. Priestess Sidon's eyes nervously shifted back and forth between Clara and Salacia as they continued smiling at one another. Marshal Zalo yawned. We have a busy week ahead of us, Sorul, he said. Yes, of course, the minister turned away and took Amod's offered arm. Let's not waste any time. Clara peered at the couple. For just the briefest of moments, she contemplated asking Marshal Zalo about his private training with Ludmilla. Tyre. Yes, my lady. Tyre went to retrieve their umbrella and they left the temple. The last vestiges of evening light had disappeared during their conversation with the priestess, but the rains had not abated. They made their way down to the riverfront and walked along the city harbor where her barges had offloaded their cargo. It was probably the one part of the city that remained busy throughout the day as the people worked non-stop to get much-needed supplies distributed to the rest of the province. Lines of men and women transferred sacks and crates from cargo containers to awaiting wagons. Further down the harbor, Ruins Wake was in the midst of offloading its latest shipment of draft animals. A small flock of sheep had braved the journey over the Katza Plains, too. "I wonder how Miss Marchand is doing," Clara said as they idly watched the activity. "I think I see her at the base of the pier," Tyre pointed. Clara went over to strike up a casual conversation with the merchant, but the towering figure of Captain Iska crossed them first. "Oh, Countess Corlin," the elder lich said, "lovely evening, isn't it?" "Do you think so?" "Me?" The captain shrugged, "Don't care either way. The people around here sure seem chipper, though. Figured I'd just go with the flow." She smiled at the elder lich's oddly sociable manner. There were concerns that he would become more elder lich-like once his business got underway and he started getting more of what he wanted, but little seemed to change about him. If anything, he became more lively after gaining enough confidence. "How have things been for Ruins Wake?" she asked. Business has been smooth. We're seeing plenty and there's a whole lot of new magic to be had. I'd say life is good. I'm glad everything's been working out. No small thanks to you, my lady. Oh, do you want to hear something funny? What is it? Apparently, I'm a god. Clara looked up at the elder lich with a frown. Some claims can be hazardous to one's health, Captain. It's not me. It's the folks around the Draconic Kingdom that came up with it. The people working the docks have quite the imagination when it comes to curses. It's impressive, even to an elder lich. They make weather requests too, but I can't quite figure out how to cast control weather yet. Are they making direct requests? Probably not. It's always something like "May Iska give that bitch crotch rot" or "I hope old Iska gets the 1,000-year crabs on you." I had to ask around about that one. Took me weeks to get an answer. Actually, why are 9 out of 10 of those curses focused on one part of the body? The rest had to do with hair loss. She hoped he wouldn't describe all of those curses at length. A stray thought wove a thread of worry through her. "You're not answering these requests, are you?" Clara asked. "Heck, no," Captain Iska waved a skeletal claw dismissively. "They ain't paying me. It's good to see these people aren't all sunshine and flowers, though. Anyway, back in Helama, I got curious and decided to follow a group to the temple where they supposedly pray and present offerings to me." "What? Wouldn't you be curious?" "I suppose. See? I didn't get far though. Place was sanctified. Just BZZ said T once I crossed the threshold. Then they raised a big fuss over my being there. I hope nothing bad happened after that." "Nothing near as bad as the last time I tried doing something in the Draconic Kingdom. Since the undead are clearing out their enemies, I think the citizens are wary of doing anything extreme." "That's honestly a relief," Clara said. "Going into this venture, we were half afraid that the undead would be violently rejected even if they did come to help. By the way, which temple did you go to?" "The Temple of Storms. I'm an air elementalist, so it sort of fits." "The Temple of Storms, Iska." Iska was not a name used by the humans of the Draconic Kingdom. As far as she knew, the only other place where it could be found was in the ruins of Lagos, where Captain Iska had manifested under the statue of a beastman duke of the same name. It was beyond strange that the people of the Draconic Kingdom would worship a beastman from the past, so the whole thing practically begged scrutiny. With her work in the Draconic Kingdom, the mystery that Ludmilla had brought back with her from the Katza Plains had fallen far down Clara's list of priorities. Being raised as she was, she tended to stay as far away as possible from other religions, as well. However, since Draudillan's court would be focusing all of its attention on Ludmilla's offensive, Clara now found herself with plenty of time to resume her investigation. 19th day, Middle Wind Month, 1 CE, Squads 1 through 10 have assumed the positions defined in the updated schedule. "How much time do we have left?" 1 hour. Olga looked down past the neck of her skeletal dragon. It was rainy and pitch black and, as it always was at the beginning of any night shift, they were flying too high so her goggles did nothing. Both she and Raoul agreed that improving the range of their dark vision equipment was at the top of the list of future improvements if the Sorceress Kingdom's royal army expected its commanders to operate from the air. "What are the beastmen doing?" She asked, "Did anyone spot our troops?" "Enemy patrols maintain their regular behavior," the elder lich sitting behind her answered. "Barring any unprecedented individuals, their dark vision range is insufficient to detect movement on the opposite shore at night." "How are the low-level undead doing?" "Holding." She released a sigh of relief. Before coming to the Draconic Kingdom, she thought that the Katsa River was amazingly huge. Now, it only seemed average. The deluge that made the rivers look dangerously swollen just got heavier and heavier, so she was worried that all the weak undead would be swept away when they entered the forest. Thankfully, the entire offensive line was now safely waiting on the riverbed near the Beastman side. "Let's head to our starting point," she said. Olga was pressed into her seat as the skeletal dragon banked north. At some point, she discovered that it didn't actually need to do that. Skeletal dragons didn't fly because they could, they flew because they did. The way that they appeared to fly was simply an imitation of how a real dragon would fly, but it was their ability to fly that allowed them to, rather than having wings or anything like that. Lady Zaradnik said that Dame Verilyn said that skeletal dragons were bad at flying and that it didn't resemble how a real dragon flew at all, but Olga couldn't tell one way or the other. The starting point of the Royal Army's resumed offensive wouldn't be anywhere along the gentle slopes of the Forced River Valley, but at Forced Spire, the Draconic Kingdom's fortress at the border. It was occupied by one of the warrior clans of their Beastmen opponents, and it was one of the only places where the Beastmen's defensive posture meant that they would try to hold their position instead of cautiously withdrawing. It was up to her to storm the fortress. The General Staff had issued her orders along with a few objectives, and it was her job to achieve them. What she needed to do wasn't very complicated, though. Maybe it was because she was the commander and they wanted to keep things simple for her sake, or maybe it was just because simple was best. As they closed on their destination, her skeletal dragon ended up in a cloud. The Elder Lich summoned a set of wraiths to guide them along. Instead of trying to catch a glimpse of their target below, her gaze unfocused as she recalled its details from memory. Forced Spire was small, but it was tall. It was basically a tower keep inside a small wall. That was the upper part, and a steep, winding path led down to the lower part, which was composed of the stone fortifications that overlooked the bottom of the canyon carved by the Forced River. The entire thing was built against one of the canyon walls with a single bridge leading to the road on the other side of the river. Their scouts counted about 1,000 beastmen defending the place, and they were being supplied by the Beastman territories to the north. That part was different from the fortresses in the west, which didn't seem to do anything with their fellow beastmen across the border. The Royal Army hadn't come to lay siege to Forced Spire, however, so stuff like enemy supply lines didn't count. "We've arrived at our destination," the Elder Lich said. They were still in the clouds, so she could only trust that they were. "Has anyone noticed the undead?" Olga asked. A minute passed before the Elder Lich spoke again. "The sergeants have noted no changes. They are, however, limited in their reconnaissance coverage. We're so strong, yet we can see so little." 2 infantry squads were enough to crush the Baharuth Empire's Imperial Army dozens of times over, yet they couldn't see what was going on in a single fortress. The Elder Liches and Death Priests were conserving mana for the assault, so they didn't have any summons to look around with. "How much time do we have?" 10 minutes. "Prepare for descent," Olga said. "Drop to 100 meters when you're ready. Protection from arrows. Reinforce armor. Shield wall. Lesser resistance." The Elder Lich cast several more defensive spells on itself before casting the same list of spells on the skeletal dragon and Olga. Once it was done, it cast invisibility on them. Olga's ears popped several times as the skeletal dragon rapidly shed altitude. "Where's the ground?" "Oh, there it is." A canyon wall was the first thing that appeared in her dark vision, followed by the tower keep of Forced Spire. Her skeletal dragon maneuvered away from the structure, staying far from the sentries manning the battlements. The roar of the swollen river soon filled her hearing and they leveled out over the canyon floor. Olga peered at the lower fortifications as they circled them from a safe distance. "The drawbridge is up, but they don't look like they're super alert for anything. It's just Osalo like the report said." "Wait, isn't that bad?" Forced Spire was built as a fortification that followed the logic of people that fought on the ground. For a human, the only way in or out was using the bridge, but Osalo were reportedly semi-arboreal, which meant they could dwell in the trees. That meant that they were good climbers and, more importantly, normally thought in 3 dimensions instead of 2 like the average human. Olga adjusted the lenses of her goggles, carefully examining the sentries. Surely enough, they weren't just paying attention to any potential approaches from the ground, they were looking up and down and all around. Her orders were to capture Forced Spire with 2 infantry squads. No one was supposed to escape. The problem was that Osalo didn't need to leave over the bridge, they could just climb away. Down or up. The undead wouldn't be able to notice the sneaky ones escaping the fight. Were the General Staff's orders really that sloppy? She couldn't imagine that they were, so maybe she was overthinking things. Maybe they would fight to the death to hold their position. Arg. Sursana, what do I do? She immediately took back her question. The gods didn't give answers so easily. As a follower of the Six, it was up to her to make the best of what she had. After staring at the walls for another minute, she motioned for the Elder Lich to ascend. Did they say how long it would take to clear the lower part of the fortress? She asked after they rose to a safe altitude to speak. No estimate was issued by the General Staff, the Elder Lich answered. How long do you think it will take? This one can only say that it should take less than 15 minutes. That was plenty of time for the defenders to run if they chose. She couldn't let that happen. 5 minutes remain, the Elder Lich noted. Contact the sergeants, Olga said. Before we begin the assault, have them cast fly and invisibility on their squads. They'll fly to evenly spaced points 100 meters above the walls. Be advised, the burden of maintaining so many fly spells at once will be extreme. That's fine, it won't be for long. When the attack commences, they'll drop down onto the walls. Be advised, the Elder Lich said again. A fall from that altitude will result in damage to the Death Series servitors. A lot of damage? No. Then we'll heal it. Anyway, the Death Knights will be spaced out along the walls in such a way that their area taunt will keep anyone from escaping. The Death Warriors just need to drop down and make a bunch of flashy kills to set things up. If there's anyone that can break free of the trap, the Death Priests will restrain them with crowd control spells. She waited for a moment to see if the Elder Liches had anything to say. After a dozen seconds of silence went by, she continued. Once we secure the bottom of the fortress, we'll head to the top. Everyone that can will summon wraiths to patrol the sides and make sure the Osalo don't sneakily crawl off somewhere while we get them all. Is there anything wrong with what I planned out? We have not identified anything inherently problematic. Preparations are commencing now. Please note that they will cause us to lag behind our schedule by roughly 2 minutes. That's fine. We're not coordinating an attack with anyone, we're the ones starting everything off. Olga could almost feel the Elder Lich's crimson gaze boring a hole into the back of her head. If nothing had started yet, it didn't matter beyond technically being late, did it? They didn't have an expected time frame for completing the assault. If she started 2 minutes late and ended 5 minutes early, she'd still start the advance sooner. The skeletal dragon circled over the keep twice more before the Elder Lich stirred behind her. Your forces await your command. My forces. Throughout the campaign in the Draconic Kingdom, she had done plenty of observation and little things here and there. This was the first time, however, she felt like she was about to do something momentous and commander-ish. Olga looked down across the wing of her skeletal dragon as it banked again. She couldn't see her soldiers, but they were down there, somewhere. Dash. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. I still can't do it. Commanders were supposed to be able to issue their orders across the battlefield. They weren't just words that inspired the troops or told people to do things, it was an ability that has power. The legends always spoke of that power, of great leaders who could seemingly shape the battlefield according to their will. She didn't think that she could become a legend, but she also didn't think that just a bit was too much to ask. Yet, at the most momentous moment in all of her 13 years, she couldn't do it. We are 3 minutes behind. Whatever. Drop. Hundreds of Osalo heads turned up at her voice. Olga cringed, resisting the urge to bury her face in her hands. She wanted her moment back. Her troops slammed onto the walls. The defending sentries looked about in confusion, as they could only sense the sound and impact of the invisible landing. A split second later, they were given plenty to look at as 4 sprays of blood simultaneously erupted along the wall. We're under attack. It's the undead. There are only 4. Take them down. The defenders converged on her 4 death warriors. Gleaming black greatswords carved bloody arcs through 3 and 4 beastmen at a time, sending limbs and whole bodies flying. Yet the beastmen still came, pouncing with their claws extended and fangs bared. Olga frowned at the sight. Why are they still attacking? Where am I? Her eyes widened in alarm. Break your invisibility. You can't taunt them if they can't detect you. Priests, keep our warriors alive. She leaned forward, fists clenched over her thighs. The defensive power of death warriors was relatively weak, and hundreds of beastman warriors could bring them down fast. Then, all at once, the scenery below seemed to freeze. No, the rain was still falling and the death warriors were still swinging. It was the beastmen that stopped. Most of them, at least. All across the wall, death knights appeared as they delivered vicious stabs and cuts to the nearest Osalo to invalidate their invisibility. The death priests remained invisible, as they weren't performing any direct attacks, but she could see her death warriors recovering from their heals. Olga heaved a sigh of relief, leaning back against the Elder Lich as the carnage spread below. Bring in the sergeants, she said. Tell them to make sure the Death Knights get their fill of squire zombies. Let's get set up for the next. The renewed clash of battle rose from below. Olga leaned forward again, peering down at the lower fortress courtyard. Osalo warriors were flooding in from the rear, roaring as they charged at the undead. It seemed that the battlefield wouldn't simply wait for her. She scanned the clash playing out in the fortress. Are the Death Knights out of taunt range? They cannot cover the entire courtyard, but the beastmen nearest the wall should still be affected. Now that the Elder Lich mentioned it, she noticed that the Osalo that had been neatly frozen were beginning to move again. They showed no hesitation in attacking their former comrades who had been turned into squire zombies and zombies. Her troops were still working through the beastmen, but the beastmen only intensified their counterattack in response. I think there's a lord down there doing that, she muttered after watching for a while longer. This one cannot be certain, the Elder Lich said, but your conjecture is likely correct. The unbending behavior of the enemy is consistent with similar cases where a commander is present. Shall we prioritize any suspected lords? No, leave them for last. She knew how hopeless it was as someone with sufficient information on the battlefield and its participants, but the commander below would only have fragments of what was going on. Until they developed a clearer picture, they would likely continue attempting to hold the fortress they were assigned to defend. The Osalo continued attacking, dying in droves until all that remained was a large Osalo with a dozen or so of its companions. They stood there in shock for a few moments before turning to flee. Too late, Olga sighed. A throwing axe flickered through the darkness, burying itself in the back of the Lord's head. His retinue was overrun seconds later. Silence fell over the surroundings and her troops started to form up in the fortress courtyard. Summon wraiths to investigate the upper keep and its surroundings, she told the Elder Lich. Get rid of any beastmen you notice trying to escape. Understood. Olga looked down at the blood-soaked battlefield with a rising sense of annoyance. Despite her seemingly successful assault, she didn't feel happy at all. Do you think this happens everywhere? She asked. People dying like this because their commanders don't understand the situation they're in? Or are too proud or stubborn to withdraw? This one cannot be certain, the Elder Lich replied, but your conjecture is likely correct. Captain, Commander Leluvian said, Forced's power has been secured. Amod released the breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Any complications? Captain Zaradnik asked. None that threatened the mission's objectives, the half-elf commander answered. However, Olga did see fit to note that the defenders had been afflicted by hold-the-line disease. We need to come up with a better name for that, the captain muttered. You may commence the operation. I will see to it that Queen Auriculus is informed. With that, the Baroness left the war room, a repurposed tavern in an abandoned town just behind the front lines. Given that Her Majesty was still in Fallujah, contacting her likely involved using some magical means to communicate with Countess Corlin's delegation, who would in turn deliver the information to the Queen on the Sorceress Kingdom's royal army's behalf. Yet another thing that we need to figure out. If the Draconic Kingdom had its own means of magically delivering information, then Amod could have carried out the task. More importantly, once the Sorceress Kingdom's royal army left, the Draconic Kingdom had no way to do so at all. They needed to recruit and train communications officers for that purpose. The problem was that message was a second-tier spell and he could count the number of individuals capable of second-tier magic on his fingers and toes. On the plus side, they were all soldiers in the Draconic Kingdom's royal army, the clerics of Highfoot. Unfortunately, none of them had learned the message spell due to the taboos surrounding its use. Furthermore, they were needed by their respective companies, so he couldn't just take them away and scatter them around the country. What the Draconic Kingdom required was dedicated staff for every military station, but, in the wake of the occupation, competition for magic casters would be stiff. In other words, they would be expensive and the limited budget of the military would have a hard time competing with the entire private sector. At least things won't be rigged like the adventurer guild is. Second-tier casters aren't impossibly rare. Plus, it's a military job but the posting is low risk. Amod's gaze absently went between the Forst and the Bileus. Despite the signal to advance, nothing had changed. Suddenly, an elder lich reached out with a plotting rod and moved one of the squad markers 1 millimeter. Was it even a millimeter? He sighed and turned away from the table. Those experienced in warfare often said that 99.9% of it consisted of waiting, and that appeared to be true. Standing around waiting for things to happen, however, was very different from someone arriving to conveniently inform the court with a compilation of past events. Kartol. Yilmaz. There's no need to follow me so closely. After arriving at one of the tables set up in the shadowed fringes of the room, Amod glanced at his two new aides. With things in the West well on their way to being sorted out, they had been assigned to his department and joined him on the barge back from Fallujah. Along with himself, the two had been selected as candidates for marshal. Sarwakanian's survival, however, meant that 2 out of 3 of the marshal positions had been filled and the court wanted to see if any other experienced commanders would miraculously show themselves. Still, like Amod, Kartol and Yilmaz had been aiming for a position in the military from the start. They were more than happy to secure anything, and Amod thought their situation a great deal less absurd than his own. They hadn't been dumped into a leadership position with rudimentary knowledge and no experience, after all. Yet, now, they look up to me for some reason. Kartol is older than I am, damn it. Despite his offer to step down should more suitable candidates appear, the Queen insisted that he stay where he was. A part of him believed that it was solely due to his connection with Baroness Saradnik, but he knew that Her Majesty's calculations were far shrewder than that. Would you like some fresh tea, Your Excellency? Like a ghost, Lady Saradnik's maid appeared before him. Yes, thank you, Miss Lutzi. The maid lowered her head with a smile before retreating to the kitchen of the repurposed tavern. Kartol and Yilmaz tracked her with their gazes until she disappeared from view. This war room is a conundrum to any man, Yilmaz said after he took a seat across the table from Amod. On one hand, you have exotic and beautiful young women. On the other, you have the undead. And sometimes, Kartol added, the exotic and beautiful young women are undead. Amod turned a sharp look at Kartol. What do you mean by that? You know, Kartol made voluminous motions in front of his chest, the vampires. Oh. Them. For a moment, he thought that Kartol was about to make the insane assertion that Baroness Saradnik was one of the undead. Despite her imposing image and the sense of danger that accompanied her wherever she went, that was hardly all that defined her. Don't tell me you have eyes for those postal workers, Yilmaz said. And why not? Kartol shrugged, they are what they are, no? The legends say that powerful vampires are bewitching in appearance, and so they are. No harm comes from appreciating beauty. The souls of your ancestors will weep when the only remaining sign of their house is turned into a decidedly less than bewitching vampire spawn. Hey, now, you shouldn't speak ill of that which you do not know. I have spoken with them and they are most pleasant. Yilmaz reached into his coat and produced a small crystal vial. He unstoppered it and splashed Kartol with a few drops of clear liquid. What was that for? Kartol wiped his brow and sniffed at the moisture on his fingers. Just checking. You brought holy water with you? Amod frowned. Your Excellency did not? Yilmaz frowned back. All that aside, Kartol leaned forward, is this all right? I don't mean to sound disrespectful to our allies, but this almost seems a joke. The two commanders are nursing mothers, a pair of children oversee the front lines. Yilmaz leaned forward over the table as well. With the power of these undead, he said in a low voice, even a crippled dwarf rat could emerge victorious over the beastmen. and the way they answer to that mysterious general staff in some unknown somewhere. What these people do is more following instructions than leading an army. Their commentary couldn't be helped, as the situation would seem equally ridiculous to anyone. The Sorceress Kingdom conducted war in a manner unlike anything they had ever seen or heard. When most were asked for their idea of a commander, they envisioned a powerful man who led vast armies on the battlefield, not a group of women who stood over a map in a warm and safe location with every convenience one could ask for. The mere fact that they were women weighed heavily, as well. When humanity's continued existence was on the line, women were to be protected while war was the province of men. The Beastmen had their own take, which was that women gave birth to more prey and thus tended to leave young women alone in regular circumstances. Either way, both sides' reasoning used the same basic logic, and it was a point that they tacitly agreed upon. As such, women were nearly unheard of in the army period, never mind commanders who were women. Amod believed that there was an opportunity for them to serve in the same fashion that the Lionum sisters did, however. Because they worked in safety, it didn't run afoul of the baseline cultural norms in the Draconic Kingdom and would be easier for people to accept. You two wouldn't have any problems working with our own woman commanders, would you? Amod asked. The two aides exchanged a look. I wouldn't have any problems, Cutthole said, so long as their competence is proven. Having a fine lady to work with is always welcome. I can't recall any noble women expressing an interest in the military, historically. Yilmaz rubbed his chin. Even now, when there are foreign female commanders left, right and center, all of our ladies have gone off to work in every ministry but ours. Amod grunted. That was another thing. Just because positions were open didn't mean that people would appear to fill them. Preconceptions and cultural norms applied to everyone, and the noble women of the court based their aims on them. Then I suppose us men will be doing twice as much work compared to every other ministry, relatively speaking. I've never considered it that way. Cutthole crossed his arms with a thoughtful expression. We lose out on half of the labor pool because the ladies never consider joining the Ministry of War. That's true, Yilmaz nodded sagely. Moreover, if Delaros were marshal, our budget problems would have been long solved. Alas, we must make do with this lump of stone. Yilmaz preemptively stepped back from Amod's swat. Cutthole laughed. Your tea, my lords, Miss Lutzie's voice came from nearby. They settled down as the maid served their refreshments. Not only was there tea, but a small variety of sweetened biscuits. Amod was barely 2 sips into his beverage when Lady Zaradnikri appeared from the stairs leading to the inn suites. The three of them rose from their seats, joining her at the main table. He examined what had changed on the map since they stepped away. Out of the 30 infantry squads along the front, only 10 had moved, the 5 northernmost and 5 southernmost. One of the squads from Forced Spire had pushed ahead along the border to join the patrols keeping the Beastmen from fleeing north. The Beastmen in question had yet to make contact with the undead, so their markers remained where they were. Though only 10 minutes had passed since the start of their advance, things still felt slow. But it was a deceptive sort of slow. Even if the undead were scouring every village along the way, they were tireless. One could take a nap and wake up to find that they had moved a surprising distance. Have there been any changes in Rivergarden? Captain Zaradnik asked. None, at last report, Commander Lynam answered. Shiom is positioned inside near the western walls, and the city routines remain the same. His eyes went to the confluence of the Forced and the Oraculon, where 30,000 dominated undead from Katsa were amassed. Those forces, along with the 5 infantry squads escorting them, were the active component of the undead horde. More so than ever, they were meant to seize the imaginations of the enemy leadership. To Amod, who saw the whole picture, the effort seemed oddly incongruous or even cheap. The command centers of the Beastmen were lined along the Oraculon, and the central component of the undead army would serve as the face of the undead forces across the entire front. Whenever undead movements were reported, they would be likened to the central force, as it would be subject to the most frequent and direct reconnaissance. With only tiny, incomplete fragments of what was going on across the entire front being reported to them, the enemy directly in the Beastman leadership's faces would dominate their thinking. It was part deception and part exploitation. Their enemy didn't use any form of magical communication, divination, or aerial reconnaissance. They relied on a network of scouts who doubled as runners to deliver information on enemy movements. The Beastman military was loosely organized at best, with tribal hierarchies serving as a command structure. Even as powerful as they were, the Sorceress Kingdom's forces chose to prey on those weaknesses, because even with all of their power, they couldn't completely control the precise outcomes of the campaign. They could only encourage events to move in the desired direction. Many likened war to the various board games that were meant to represent it. Amod was one of them, but he now understood how laughable the comparison was. Rules, pieces, conditions for victory and defeat, even the shape of the board itself, they were fluid and ever-changing from moment to moment. The different sides didn't even have to be playing the same game. "It's all right to bring your tea over, Your Excellency," Captain Zaradnik told him. "We're in for a long wait." Over the next 2 hours, the markers continued to move forward, millimeter by millimeter. According to expectations, the Beastmen cautiously withdrew before the unexpected and aggressive push. The front resolved into two main lines, that of the advancing undead forces, and that of the retreating Beastmen. The strategic review stated that this would happen, Amod said, but it's strange how neatly it came together. "We're only seeing markers on a map, Your Excellency," the Baroness said. "What's going on is likely a lot messier than this." With that, she set down her own cup of tea. Her gloved hands moved to collect the documents in front of her into their respective folders. The folders disappeared into the magical container on her right hip. "What's happening?" Amod asked as she stepped away from the table and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" "I am a captain, Your Excellency," Baroness Zaradnik replied with a smirk. "And a captain's place is on the front lines.